When I was growing up, I was taught that Sunday was the Christian Sabbath. I really didn't know exactly what that meant, nor did I know anyone who was not Christian. All I knew about the Sabbath is it was the day that we went to church. Over the years, I have come to understand that Sabbath is so much more. It's easy to forget how integral Sabbath was only a generation or so ago. Despite being one of the 10 Commandments, the Sabbath command seems to have slipped through the cracks. Throughout history, Sabbath has been both rigorously observed and heartily debated. For Jews and other strict Sabbatarians, such as the Seventh-day Adventists, the practice of keeping or remembering the Sabbath has always been an integral part of every week, which is observed on the seventh day of the week, usually Saturday. For Christian Sabbatarians who keep the Sabbath on the first day of the week, usually Sunday, treat it as new Sabbath from the old Sabbath. For almost everyone else, it's become a lost commandment. What has changed and how? Is Sabbath still important, or did it ebb out of culture for a reason? If the other commandments are permanent, why is this commandment variable? In fact, Jesus violated the Sabbath by the standard of the Jews. He said to the Jews that, 1. Man was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man. This means that Sabbath was not meant to be a burden of man conforming to it, but instead find delight in keeping it. 2. Jesus says that the Son of Man was Lord over the Sabbath. This means that we should find rest in him as he is sovereign over Sabbath. Mark 2 verses 23 to 28 NIV says, 23. One Sabbath Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. 24. The Pharisees said to him, Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? 25. He answered, Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? 26. In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. 27. Then he said to them, The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. 28. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. The New Testament records Jews and converts to Judaism meeting in synagogues on the Sabbath in the following verses. Mark 6 verse 2, Luke 4 verse 31, Luke 13 verses 10 to 16, Acts 13 verses 14 and 27, 42-44, Acts 15:21, Acts 16 verse 13, Acts 17 verse 2, Acts 18 verse 4. Obviously, with no work being done on the Sabbath day, the Sabbath day would be the ideal day to have organized worship services. However, the New Testament does not command that the Sabbath be the day of worship. The church is not under the Mosaic law. The church is under the New Covenant, established by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The Bible nowhere describes Christians setting aside the Sabbath day as the day of worship. The only scriptures that describe Christians in any sense meeting on the Sabbath are in fact pointing to evangelistic efforts at Jewish synagogues, which met on the Sabbath day. Acts 2 verse 46 records the early Christians meeting every day. The Bereans studied the scriptures every day, Acts 17 verse 11. Acts 20 verse 7 and 1 Corinthians 16 verse 2 both mention Christians meeting on the first day of the week. There is no evidence in the New Testament that the apostles or the early Christians in any sense observed the Sabbath day as the prescribed day of worship. Let's start from the beginning, the very beginning, and see who is correct or what the Bible says. Genesis chapter 2 story of creation ends with the seventh day when God rested from the work he had done. To emulate God, the 10 Commandments reserve the seventh day and require humans to do the same. Not only is it set apart for rest, but the Sabbath is also made holy. God called all things in creation good, but he called the seventh day holy. In the language of the Bible, the world was brought into being in the 6 days of creation, yet its survival depends upon the holiness of the seventh day. Great are the laws that govern the processes of nature. Yet without holiness, there would be neither greatness nor nature. The Sabbath was elevated above all days. It was unique. This is because the whole work of creation was completed. The Sabbath was special as God rested on this day as he was satisfied with his work. God constituted and blessed the seventh day, and this day reminds us about the 6-day creation. Thus to claim that it took year for the universe to be created, you unbless the Sabbath. In fact, before the fall of man there was no Sabbath. In Genesis, even the patriarchs did not keep the Sabbath as the law. This was not mentioned as day of worship. The Sabbath was later mentioned in Exodus chapter 16. Moses institutes Sabbath in Exodus 31 verses 12 to 18 NIV says. 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, 13. Say to the Israelites, You must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so you may know that I am the Lord, who makes you holy. 14. Observe the Sabbath, because it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates it is to be put to death. Those who do any work on that day must be cut off from their people. 15. For 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day is to be put to death. 16. The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for the generations to come as a lasting covenant. 17. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. 18. When the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the covenant law, the tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God. The holiness of Sabbath drove Jews to treat the day as set apart, which is what the Hebrew word for holy actually means. It was not merely a day to recharge one's batteries, it was a day that the rest of the week could not survive without. For both ancient and modern Jews, a typical Sabbath, or Shabbat, began, and still begins, on Friday afternoon with preparation. Like anticipating the arrival of a special guest, the house is cleaned, the family bathes and dresses in their finest, and the Sabbath meals, for both Friday and Saturday, are made ahead of time so no work has to be done while celebrating Shabbat. Sabbath was not merely a day to recharge one's batteries, it was a day that the rest of the week could not survive without. For modern Jews, Sabbath officially begins at sunset according to Mosaic law. The 2 Shabbat candles are lit, representing Zachar and Shemer, to remember and to observe. The woman of the house then recites a blessing, no later than 18 minutes before the sun sets. After attending a brief 45-minute evening service, families come home for a festive, leisurely dinner. But before the meal, the man of the house recites Kiddush, a prayer recited over a cup of wine or other liquid, no less than 3.3 ounces, to sanctify the Sabbath. Part of the prayer reads, "You have lovingly and willingly given us your holy Shabbat as an inheritance, in memory of creation. The Shabbat is the first among our holy days, and a remembrance of our exodus from Egypt." Another prayer is recited over 2 loaves of challah, a sweet, braided bread, before the meal begins. There are no particular requirements on what type of food should be prepared, but to avoid labor, it is usually a stewed or slow-cooked meal that can be reheated or kept warm for the remainder of the Sabbath. After dinner, the Birkat Hamazon is recited, a grace after meals. The family then takes an hour or 2 to read and talk about the Torah before bed. On Saturday morning, Shabbat services begin around 9 a.m. and go until about noon. After the service, families say the Kiddush again and enjoy another leisurely meal. By the time the second Birkat Hamazon is said, it is late afternoon. The family studies the Torah, talks, takes a walk, and perhaps plays easy games or takes naps. There will be another light meal before sunset. Sabbath ends at sundown when 3 stars can be seen in the sky. Then, it is time for Havdalah, which means separation or division. Blessings are said over spices, wine, and candles. The blessings speak of the separation between the sacred and the secular and between the Sabbath and the rest of the days of the week. At the heart of the Sabbath commandment is the Hebrew word to rest, menucha. It means to refrain from any productive activity. Over time, rabbinical law elaborated on this word, coming up with 39 categories of work that were to be avoided on the Sabbath. In the Talmud tractate Shabbat, 24 chapters of post-biblical, rabbinical law specifically pertaining to Sabbath regulations beyond what is commanded in the Talmud, the notion of rest on the Sabbath is greatly reinforced. One must not touch money, move items from private to public ground, write more than 2 letters of the alphabet, carry more than the weight of 1/2 of a dried fig, or drag a stick along the ground on the Sabbath in case the ground be plowed. There are detailed guidelines on how shoes should be put on, ordinances concerning hairpins and perfume bottles, and a chapter dedicated to regulations concerning the tying and untying of knots on the Sabbath. All the regulations can be boiled down to 2 principles: do not create and do not be lord over nature, just for 1 day a week. A rabbi explained the Sabbath to a group of Christians touring the Holy Land in this way. The Talmud, he said, gives us 3 reasons for keeping the Sabbath. The first reason for Sabbath, he went on, is that given the fact that no one is permitted to do anything on Shabbat, no orders could be given, no work done. Therefore, the slaves and the rich would be equal for at least 1 day a week. The second reason is that we have time to reflect on the meaning of our lives. The third reason for Sabbath is that we can reflect on the goodness of our work as God did on creation on the 7th day. In modern society, we have come to understand the Sabbath as a command to rest, to take a break once a week. And while the day is certainly intended for people to abstain from work, extended travel, spending money, and other activities, The meaning behind the painstaking regulations is much deeper. The principle involved in deciding what is work here is not so much the physical nature of an activity, but its purpose. If its intent signifies human power over nature, if it shows human mastery of the world by the purposeful and constructive exercise of intelligence and skill, then it is malucha, work, which violates the restful intent of Sabbath time to recognize our dependence on God as ultimate creator-sustainer. Here the Sabbath is for God's sake, a day to be kept holy accordingly. True rest is about truly giving up control. Most people believe all they need to do to rest is stop working. For Jews, even thinking about work is considered a breach of the commandment. To be planning out their schedules for the upcoming week even violates the spirit and intent of Sabbath. That is why the Jewish Sabbath requires meticulous planning, requiring comprehensive preparation during the day leading up to it. True rest is about truly giving up control, handing over one day a week so they remember even the other 6 days aren't truly theirs. The seventh day signifies a time for humans to relinquish their place at the helm of their lives and to pay homage to that seventh day of creation, when the creator of the universe himself rested. To observe the seventh day does not mean merely to obey or to conform to the strictness of a divine command, says Heschel. To observe is to celebrate the creation of the world and to create the seventh day all over again, the majesty of holiness in time, a day of rest, a day of freedom, a day which is like a Lord and King of all other days, a Lord and King in the commonwealth of time. Despite the deep roots of the Jewish Sabbath, the early Christian church was left to grapple with if and how Sabbath would fit into Jesus' mission for them. Many Christians dismissed Sabbath as too legalistic and irrelevant to the Christian life. Jesus had come to abolish the law, but was it his intent that Sabbath not be a part of Christian practice? Jesus healed and ministered on the Sabbath day, which brought harsh judgment from his critics. When Jews attacked Jesus with their "you aren't keeping the Sabbath right" accusations based on their man-made regulations, they were accusing the architect and engineer of creation week, the one who had himself blessed the seventh day and made it holy. He used the occasion to reiterate what had been true from the beginning: the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Their multitudinous, minute restrictions had reversed the formula. He then announced that he was Lord even of the Sabbath, Mark 2 verse 28, its very creator, and thus its rightful interpreter. It is a common view, and perhaps misconception, that because of his non-orthodox treatment of the Sabbath, Jesus abolished the need to observe the seventh day altogether. If he is Lord even of the Sabbath, does that mean Sabbath is no more? Modern Christians, myself included, have often misread Jesus' statements on how one should observe the Sabbath as making a statement in the negative regarding whether we should observe a Sabbath. We have taken Jesus' liberal interpretation of the law, liberal in doing good, as a dismissal of the Sabbath's importance. This day of rest, Jesus says, is made for humans, Mark 2 verse 27. Jesus claims himself as Lord of the Sabbath. This lordship does not abolish the Sabbath, for why would Jesus abolish something over which he claims himself as ruler? But instead he reinforces its vitality for life. We who call Jesus our Lord would do well to open up space, a Sabbath rest, in which we benefit from the Lord of the Sabbath, who seeks to do good, to save life, and to restore health. For early Christians, as is still true today, to live by grace meant to not live by the law. So evidence for how the early church treated the Sabbath is varied. It seems the new church celebrated Sabbath as a remembrance of creation, but Jesus' resurrection lent new meaning to their Sabbaths. Although there is ambiguity surrounding exactly how Christians observed the Sabbath after the formation of the church, one thing is clear: throughout history, there has always been debate among Christians surrounding the practice. Traditionally, Christians have held their primary corporate worship services on Sundays, the first day of the week, in celebration of Christ's resurrection, which occurred on a Sunday, Matthew 28 verse 1, Mark 16 verse 2, Luke 24 verse 1, John 20 verse 1. It is important to understand, though, that Sunday is not the commanded day of corporate worship, either. There is no explicit biblical command that either Saturday or Sunday be the day of worship. Scriptures such as Romans 14 verses 5 to 6 and Colossians 2 verse 16 give Christians freedom to observe a special day or to observe every day as special. We see first day worship, Saturday night or Sunday morning, in honor of the day of Jesus' resurrection, was often observed in conjunction with rest on the seventh day, Saturday. By the 2nd century, Sunday worship was a widespread Christian tradition. Thus, it became known as the Lord's Day and later Sunday, and in many denominations, it supplanted the Sabbath. God's desire is that we worship and serve Him continually, every day, not just on Saturday or Sunday. In 321 AD, the Christianized Roman Emperor Constantine declared Sunday a day of rest, although it was in honor of the venerable day of the sun, hence the name of the day, not of the traditional Sabbath. In 789, Charlemagne made a decree that prohibited all ordinary labor on Sunday on the grounds that it violated the fourth commandment. Until the Reformation, laws regarding action on Sunday were fairly open for discussion since it was agreed that Sunday was an invention of the Church, not instituted by God after creation. Martin Luther, in his endeavors to fight the legalism of the Roman Catholic Church, agreed with previous notions that the Sabbath was moot. He even went so far as to say the New Testament repealed the Sabbath command. He believed Christians should have an attitude of worship daily and that the Sunday tradition should be observed with freedom. Not everyone agreed. For America, Sunday observance of Sabbath is a part of its foundational history. The 17th-century Puritans' famed voyage to the New World was spurred on by prejudice against their religious views, particularly their more strict observance of the Sabbath. The Puritan Sabbath retained much vitality and dominance in the United States until the 19th century, when it faced insurmountable challenges including the massive immigrations of people holding a different understanding of life and Sunday, says Edwards. By the time of the Enlightenment, Sunday was observed as a day of prayer and perhaps a day to refrain from work. In America, Benjamin Franklin was using his Sundays as a day of study. His open interpretation was not uncommon. In more modern times, Sabbath has slipped away at a much more rapid pace. In a 2003 article for the New York Times, Judith Shulevitz, also author of the book The Sabbath World, writes about her experience being a Jew in Brooklyn in much more recent times, implementing Sabbath practices into her own life, and how the idea of Sabbath is fading away. Even after Puritanism lost its hold on American culture, the American Sunday was observed with unusual strictness. In 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville observed with some surprise that few Americans were permitted to go on a hunt, to dance or even play an instrument on Sunday. As recently as 125 years ago, you would have been hard-pressed to find a museum or library open on Sunday. 80 years ago, football was considered too vulgar to be played on Sunday. Oldsters remember standing in line at the bank on Fridays to get cash for the weekend. Youngsters assume they can withdraw at will. Anyone older than 30 can remember living with the expectation that most stores would be closed on Sunday. The expectation now is that they will be open, and we're miffed when they aren't. We can still see remnants of the Sabbath that was. A select few banks and businesses reserve Sunday for closed doors, and most office jobs require their employees to show up only Monday through Friday. For the most part, our Sundays are now filled with catching up on work, cleaning the house, shuttling the kids to soccer games, and perhaps fitting in church in the morning. Few of us are locking away our electronic devices, let alone our musical instruments. The loss of the Sabbath in modern times is one example of our expanded use of time. Since we have access to light, the internet, and convenience stores 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, we can work, shop, or eat any time of the day or night. There is no natural or compulsory rhythm to our days, perhaps not even to our weeks. As our culture began to shift, Sabbath and the idea of a day to completely rest became less and less valued. Labor laws in the United States and elsewhere in the 19th century asserted the right of government to protect laborers from the physical and moral debasement of uninterrupted labor, says Edwards. These laws often went further and protected Sunday as a day of shared rest, so that family life and other relationships could be nurtured in a way that would be impossible if days off were staggered. This vision has been breaking down in the face of pressures to open stores for business on Sundays, to sustain industrial production and maintenance, and to view days off in private terms. The same people who had grown up setting each Sunday aside were abandoning rest on the weekend for all the new opportunities Sundays now afforded. In the 80s and 90s, the typical weekend shifted from restful to unrelenting. Eating out on a Sunday is now a traditional activity for many families. Even the preparation to worship became harried in itself. New Sunday practices lead to even more hectic weekends, like commuting to a more distant church instead of investing in a local congregation, or participating in weekend concentrated soccer or Pop Warner leagues. We are a far cry from watching how we tie knots or locking away our work on the weekends. As Sabbath has disintegrated, our lives have become more accelerated and restless. At creation, before the existence of Pop Warner or restaurants or industrial society, God earmarked one day out of 7. He knew humans would need reprieve, a time to stop and remember why we are living the lives we are living. It could be said that Sabbath was tucked into our DNA at the very beginning. We should be thankful for the grace built into the ability to pause. Creation ended, even with all the glorious activity of all that God had fashioned, with the climax of rest. Why would God need to stop? After all, He is God. And if God stopped, it begs the question, why it is important that we also learn to stop. Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, one of the most significant rabbinic authorities since the Middle Ages, said it this way: God stopped to show us that what we create becomes meaningful to us only once we stop creating it and start to think about why we did so. We should be thankful for the grace built into the ability to pause. After all, if all of creation ended with rest, it's a small appeal that our weeks end with the same. We have to remember to stop because we have to stop to remember. Sabbath means rest, but everyone rests, not just the holy people or the privileged ones. The Sabbath is the great equalizer that joins all of God's creation together. Our world is divided in such a way that cries out for something, anything that brings us together. I would be comforted to know everyone is resting regardless of their station in life. Do you know the meaning of your life? My meaning changes with each task or role that is sent my way. Sabbath rest is a time to focus on the central reason for your existence. Perhaps if we all took the time to reflect in such a way, we would suddenly find that God gives us great peace. So many of us see ourselves and the world as being self-made. Sabbath says stop and acknowledge your own powerlessness in view of God's creation. The world could be a so much better place if we would take the time to acknowledge it as God's creation.